So good morning, everyone. Very happy to see you here. I was well introduced by Egbert, so I suggest I immediately jump to the content of today's presentation. And I would like to share in particular some thoughts with you on post-growth economics. And just as a starters, I would like to sketch four main characteristics of a post-growth economy. And a first characteristic of a post-growth economy is that it is an economy in which we use significantly less materials and significantly less energy. So it's not only about greening energy sources or changing the materials that we use in our production systems. No, it is also about significantly less use of materials and energy, because with greening the energy sources alone, we are not going to stay within planetary boundaries. Secondly, this means that we will produce and consume less. And this is kind of frightening many policymakers, many economists, and even civil society, because they think, well, less production, less consumption equals less fun. So a second point of post-growth economics is that it is about an economy which is less dependent on quantitative, so let's say GDP growth. A third characteristic is that we aim to improve the quality of life. So we shift the attention away from quantitative growth to qualitative growth. We aim at a higher quality of life, not despite less production and consumption, but thanks to less production and consumption. And this does not only mean the quality of our own small individual lives, no, it means the quality of everything that is living. And fourthly, post-growth economics is about, it has a global perspective. So it is about enjoying the resources of the earth equally globally. So for today, I have the following contents. I would like to discuss with you why there is an urgent need for fresh perspectives, the core problem, the age of qualitative growth, and then I hope there is some time left for questions and discussions. And when we go to this first agenda point, I think in this room, many of you are aware of the issues that are going on, and you are also familiar with the urgency, with the need to make changes quickly and radically. But you must also understand that from post-growth Netherlands, we operate in the realm of politicians, political parties, governments, and that's also the organizations and the people whom we advise to. So they have to deal also with the people who vote for them, and they also have to deal with their own paradigms that they have been taught in the past, and that is also our main audience whom we try to address. So I would like to first sketch four different schools of thought that we may find in society. And here you see then it's green growth, it's anti-economism, it's denial, and it's pragmatism. And I think each of these four schools of thought has their own strengths and their own weaknesses. So if we look at green growth, what we see is that what's wrong is a continuation of the status quo, and most importantly, there is insufficient empirical support. So this idea of green growth is based on the theory of decoupling. And in fact, I would say it's not a theory, it's a hypothesis, because there is no evidence for it. And the hypothesis is thus rejected. So the hypothesis is as follows. We know historically from quantitative analyses that as soon as the GDP grows, so does the negative environmental impact. For example, waste, emissions of greenhouse gases, etc. There's a one-to-one correlation. And the green growth advocates, they say, we need to decouple this correlation so that the economy, or in fact the GDP, can continue to grow, whereas the negative environmental impact goes down and may even become positive. And for this theory or hypothesis of decoupling, there is neither empirical nor theoretical evidence that this is possible. Yes, we do emit less greenhouse gases in the Netherlands since 1990. and we have witnessed significant GDP growth since then. So this, you could argue, is an example of decoupling. Yes, but the story is somewhat more complicated, and I will delve into that in a few slides. But the interesting piece of the puzzle is that there's an adequate concern for the earning potential and the public finances. We all enjoy the public services in countries such as the Netherlands, such as the education, that work for a healthcare system, the social domain, etc. So how do we continue to finance all these important institutes if the GDP will shrink? That is an important thing to think about. Then in the Netherlands we also see some anti-economy thoughts. A book has been written by one politician entitled Economism, but then in Dutch. And the main concern with that is that it's insufficiently realistic, and it can degenerate into some anti-economic thought. But what we really like about it is that there are a rightful call for more ambitious environmental policies. They say what we do right now is not sufficient, and we need this care for both environmental as well as social justice. Well, thirdly, there's the deniers, and they also have a strong voice in the Dutch society. And what's wrong? Well, I think there's too much to mention. Mostly is that there's no scientific backing, and it leads to unnecessary, even harmful polarization. At the same time, what they do very well is that they think about the worried 40. And this is a term from the Flemish sociologist. And this applies to the 40% lowest income households. And these are the people that are often being neglected. And these are also the people that do not vote, or they vote for extreme right-wing political parties. And this normally also was like 20% of the people who did not vote and 20% of the people who voted extreme right. Now there's even more people voting for extreme right, so there is a different tendency going on in the Netherlands right now. But those 40% lowest incomes, they don't benefit from subsidies on electric vehicles for as far as they are sustainable. They don't benefit from subsidies on isolating their houses or on solar panels or on heat pumps or whatsoever. They don't benefit from climate policy, and we should not forget them in order to prevent people from being forgotten. I often hear that what society needs and what those who do not aim for environmental policies need is consciousness or awareness. At the same time, I think those who are well educated need more awareness, need more consciousness of what it means to be poor. Even in the Netherlands, recently a book has been published, Poverty Explained to the Rich. And it is very easy that if you are well educated, if you have a good job with a nice income, to talk about all kinds of things that we need to do for society, but at the same time we are so easily inclined to forget the poorest people, who also in the Netherlands, in relative terms, pay the most tax, some 50% of their income, including VAT and all kinds of other taxes. Then pragmatisms, they do acknowledge the need for environmental policy, but the main weakness is that they don't have a clear vision and they don't do enough. But again, there's a right emphasis on implementation and avoidance of negative side effects. Because if we go too fast in implementing environmental and social policy, then this also leads to societal unrest. And maybe that's also something that we can derive from Lisa Herzog's lecture. People need to be part of the decision process. All people, also the worried 40. From a scientific spectrum, from a scientific perspective, we can also identify different schools. With on the one hand of the spectrum degrowth, and on the other hand grey growth. Well, the grey growth, they just pretend nothing is going on and we continue in the same way. And on the other hand, the degrowth advocates say we need planned economic contraction. What those two schools have in common is that they both have a numerical goal. It's a quantitative goal, either a bigger GDP or a smaller GDP. Vendor Steady State Economics, which is about stabilizing the GDP. It's a very interesting school, but it also is problematic if we also look to questions from the audience in previous keynotes from where do we start in resetting the unequal, or resetting the balance basically, because there's so much inequality globally in terms of prosperity and income. Now, green growth I talked about, and there's something called broad prosperity, and their policy is a trade-off between growth and other goals. For example, in Amsterdam, they have now limited the number of hotel nights by tourists to 20 million per year. More hotel nights would be good for the economy, well, let's say for the GDP or the gross regional product. But it becomes less and less livable in Amsterdam because it's so crowded by tourists that the Amsterdam people themselves don't like to live in the city center anymore. So you are going to balance ecological, social, and financial goals with one another. And then finally there is post-growth. So I already explained the four main characteristics of that, and there is a-growth or donut economics, which say growth is not a goal anymore, it's a result of staying within the donut. Now our question was, how can we maintain a good quality of life, yet at the same time collectively live within planetary boundaries in a socially just way? So the latter refers also to this 1.6 hectares that Christian referred to. If we believe that all human beings are equal, then what right do we have to live for more than 1.6 or let's say 1 hectare? At the same time, we don't want to have the feeling that we all need to live in poverty or as monks in order to stay within planetary boundaries. And I think, the question that you ask is, how are we going to piece this puzzle together? And if we are going to draft up a new story, which these are basically the founding elements of our book, what should be the requirements? And we said, well, first it has to be science-based, and with that we mean we only looked at top scientific journals. It has to be ambitious, value-driven, socially responsible, but it should also be possible to realistically implement all the policies that come out of our analysis. And the core value is to take better care of the planet and each other, and the main method is by a drastic reduction of waste in production chains. And this can be done in all kinds of different ways. For example, I have a Fairphone. And Fairphone is the first and only Dutch smartphone company. And on average, smartphones in the Netherlands are used for 2.7 years. Fairphone provides a warranty of 5 years and software support of 8 years because they want you to stimulate you to use this phone for 8 years. You can easily repair and replace parts. It's a modular phone. And it also has 2 SIM cards, so I can use both my private as well as my professional number in one phone. And this is one example of just using products longer. Of course, we can also share products. In the Netherlands, there are 9 million privately owned cars. But suppose everyone in the Netherlands would start to make use of sharing cars. Then 1 million cars would suffice to create the same mobility value as 9 million privately owned cars. Of course, the shared cars don't have the status value, but I guess that's a good thing as well to get rid of that. But that's a personal opinion. These are just 2 examples of a whole range of means of things that we can do to live a life based on sufficiency, based on community, based on sharing, and I will later on explain how this is also going to improve our qualities of life. So what is the core problem? I already mentioned, well, in the Netherlands, we reduced our emissions of greenhouse gases, and we did so by 25%. Now it's even a little bit more. A lawyer had to force our government to reduce it by 25% because the government at first was failing, but then we succeeded and we were very happy. So we were successful, right? Well, no. Why? Because there is a hidden impact of consumption. The Netherlands is a net importer of depletion. So these are some statistics that tell us how much we import on a yearly basis. And these are all staggering figures. And you also see it's lots of water, where we had a very interesting lecture about yesterday. Lots of land. This is much more land than the Netherlands used to colonize in the past. And now we control so much more land than in our colonial past, just to get the resources from the land in our direction. So, and also there is of course a historic responsibility. If you look, often when I say, well, we emit many more greenhouse gases, or we're responsible, we should reduce our greenhouse gases significantly, then people say, well, isn't China the most polluting country? And then I say, well, yes, they make the products that we consume. And secondly, from a historical perspective, we know that the EU and the US are responsible for 70% of all greenhouse gases being emitted. And this also means, according to me, that we are, together with the USA, responsible for 70% of the consequences of climate change. So here is the result. If we are going to correct this figure of 25% for everything that we import, then the Netherlands reduced its emissions of greenhouse gases not by 25%, but only by 8%. So one of the ways in which we reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases is by outsourcing polluting activities to other countries. So if we look within our country borders, yes, we reduced our emissions of greenhouse gases by 25%. If we are going to correct this figure for everything that we import, then it's only 8%. And just to add a trivial, maybe fun fact, I'm not sure if it's fun, but on the left side you see the amount of money that we spent on realizing that result. And this accumulates to over 200 billion euros of Dutch taxpayers' money spent to realize an 8% reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases. Secondly, policies do not take into account the Jevons paradox. So William Stanley Jevons was a scientist in the 19th century, and at that time in the UK was confronted with a shortage of coals. So they were afraid that soon the coal stocks would be depleted. And they say what we need is a more efficient mining of coals and a more efficient application of coals. So they did do all kinds of technical research, and then they were successful. The mining and the application, the use of the coals, became much more efficient. But as a result, it also became cheaper to mine and apply the coals. And because it became cheaper, the reserves were depleted even faster. And this is a paradox named after William Stanley Jevons. And this is also called in science a rebound effect, and we see it in all kinds of different ways. We see it coming back in our times today. This is just a recent example. For example, the engines of cars have become much more fuel efficient the past couple of decades. But this fuel efficiency did not come at the benefit of the natural environment. It came at the benefit of more car. So you see that the cars, they still use 7.5 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers driven, but now they weigh almost 1,600 kilograms, and they are 4.5 meters long. And this is a rebound effect, and the average rebound effect is 55%. And the range is between 0 and 100% for all kinds of different products. So this means there's so many companies talking about sustainability. And they say, well, the environmental impact of our product is becoming less. And yes, they are right. But this is a relative gain. And because our purchasing power continues to grow, because our GDP continues to grow, we start to consume more and more. And what we do is we consume more of relative sustainable products, and as a consequence, our absolute footprint is still growing. Even this year, the Earth Overshoot Day was again 11 days earlier in the Netherlands than last year. So our footprint is still growing, the trend is still negative. So it's very good that companies work on more sustainable products if we also consume less of them. And that's not happening. And of course, time is short. We're already late to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but I don't think that needs any explanation in this room. Thirdly, and finally, for this part of the presentation, we're stuck in a carbon tunnel vision. So what we see is that growth aggravates other problems. In our aims to green our energy sources, we need windmills and solar panels, and we think we need electric vehicles. And for that, we need all kinds of different raw materials, including lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and manganese. And here you see that according to the International Energy Agency, the demand for these raw materials will increase tremendously the next 2 decades, and for lithium even by over 4,000%. And that is a huge problem, because it's not only CO2 that leads to climate change, it's also land and material use. And I think Kees already explained yesterday the importance of trees to cool down the temperatures on Earth. And this graph basically tells the same. And I'm sorry I left some Dutch in the presentation, but if you look at those bars, then the top bar is about climate change. So what it means is that land and material use is responsible for over 50% for climate change. The second one is the loss of biodiversity, and the third one is water stress. And I don't need to explain today that this is the most topical issue of climate change, not the rising sea level, but the shortage of clean water. So, and what we see is that land and material use are responsible for over 90% of loss of biodiversity and water stress. Now, we are going to look at a somewhat more fine-grained picture. I told you, I said before, like, okay, there may be decoupling, because since 1990s, the Dutch GDP grew and the emissions of greenhouse gases fell by 8%. And you also see that in this figure. But what we see more in this figure is that our material use is increasing, our land use is increasing, our energy use is increasing, our emissions of toxic waste is increasing, and our water usage is increasing. And not only that, from a social point of view, and I don't think we should forget that, our labor from the global south. So what we did is, Paul Schendling and I, we did a study. We simply got a very simple question from a Dutch author and a publicist, and asked us how many people in non-Western countries work for the Dutch economy. And we were looking for statistics, and we couldn't find it, so we thought, let's calculate it ourselves. And we found that in full-time equivalents, 13.8 million people in non-OECD countries work for the Dutch economy under bad to very bad labor and income conditions. And this boils down to 1.8 FTE per Dutch households, whereas the Dutch themselves work 0.9 FTE per household. Putting that in a historical perspective, if we look at the economic height but the humane depth of our colonial past, in 1920, 860,000 Indonesian land labor worked for the Dutch economy, which is in absolute terms significantly less than the 13.8 million that we talk about today. Not only that, this 860,000 Indonesian land laborer at that time boiled down to 0.6 FTE per Dutch household, whereas the Dutch themselves worked 2.0 FTE per household. The households were much bigger than as they are now. So in both absolute as well as relative terms, the number of people working under bad to very bad income and labor conditions for our prosperity has grown significantly and is still growing. An intermediate conclusion is that current policies don't work. We need an absolute rather than a relative reduction of our total environmental impact. There's no evidence that current policies will do that job. And we need also stronger policies on the consumption side while remaining our prosperity intact. I will skip this slide, the shortcomings of GDP, but I think we've heard enough about it. I want to focus on qualitative growth. If we are going to consume and produce products that last long, and if we are going to share them, then our expenses will go down. And based on an average income in the Netherlands, our expenses will go down by 20%. And if we have sufficient houses in the Netherlands, it will go down even more. This means that we can work 20% less in the Netherlands. We can work 1 day less. Or we can say, no, I mean, there's nothing wrong with work. I mean, work is very meaningful and it's nice. I love to do my own work. You can also say, no, let's work the same number of hours, but at a slower pace, so that we become less susceptible to stress and burnout and related physical diseases. At this moment, 1.6 million people in the Netherlands suffer from burnout, which is 1 out of 7 or 6 laborers in the Netherlands. It's tremendous, and this trend has been ever increasing since the start of this millennium. Of course, it needs no explain that there's also qualitative growth for other forms of life. Also because we're going to share more in cooperatives or associations. We'll start a local food forest, a local energy cooperative. We meet each other. Our appointments with other people are spontaneous, next to planned, and we are less stressed. We become more creative because now we are so stressed in the Netherlands that we long for entertainment. But if we are more relaxed, we also increase our creativity. So there's so many positive sides to a sufficiency-based life. From policy point of view, we also say, let's focus our attention on the consumption side. And we have seen various presentations these 2 days, which kind of suggest the same. Jan Jufferman's Fair Earth Share, for example, and a similar thing also discussed by Christian Felber on the parallel session Monday afternoon. So we say, let's give all people a certain access to clean air or emissions of greenhouse gases, raw materials, land use, water use. And then as soon as people start to use more of that, then there will be a progressive tax on all of these resources that people use. So the tax increases exponentially. This is something different than what in the Netherlands is called a meat tax, because then there is one flat tax for all meat in the Netherlands, and then the poor people are no longer capable of buying a healthy diet, and for the rich people, meat becomes even more a status product that they can show with, look, I can afford meat, look how successful and great I am. So we say a fair consumption tax is based on an idea of Thomas Piketty, lower labor tax and supplementary policies. Now, in order to answer some questions, I will skip this, but what the result is, next to this 20% less work that we can do, it results in 38% less emissions of greenhouse gases as compared to green growth, 32% less use of materials as compared to green growth. Now, as a final conclusion, in between the 2 world wars, there were some people saying, we need a social correction to capitalism. And they came with a tremendous idea, and they said, we need to continue paying people's incomes when they are ill, or mourning, or pregnant, or even when they are jobless. And this was revolutionary at the time. And those people suggesting this idea, they were not taken seriously. They said, what you suggest is ridiculous. Our economies will collapse. It's never going to work. It's idealistic, unrealistic, forget about it. Then there was the Second World War, a huge catastrophe. And after that, in Europe, we were able to build a welfare state in which we take much better care of laborers, take care of injustice. Of course, this is eroding since the 1980s, but there we showed, hey, we were able to do it. So what we saw in the 20th century, due to a progressive income tax, we were able to build the welfare state, and we had a social correction to capitalism. The challenge of the 21st century is an ecological problem. We need progressive consumption tax and progressive wealth tax. in order to enforce an ecological correction to capitalism. This is what I would like to share, and I'm quite sure there are some questions, so maybe you want to guide it.
Thank you, Matthias, for your very insightful presentation, as always. Great, thank you so much. I can imagine there are a few questions. We don't have that much time. I see a few questions there. We have room for three questions, I think. We have three people in the middle section. Oh, Kees also has the mic. Well, okay.
I already
we'll
have
come back to you in a bit.
So thank you very much for this fantastic presentation. So you're talking about status fear several times, that is one of the engines of unsustainability. But there is another one, and that is fear of death. And this enormous medical complex, which is, I would say, also one of the big engines of unsustainability. Did you also look at the whole health issue in your post-growth system?
Yeah, people are afraid of death, and they are afraid of many things that compromise their longing and desires to live. And this also is a reflex, because we have no power in life, but we like to pretend we do. So in a reflex, we aim at control mechanisms in an effort to control life, to own life. And this is, of course, all an illusion. But we also look into health, because one of the main concerns is that if we produce and consume less, then there will be less tax income for government. So how are we going to finance healthcare and the social domain? And these two domains are by far the largest expenses of the Dutch government. Even healthcare is 1/4 of total expenditures. And basically we say the same as what you said yesterday. We can become much more healthy if we live a life without toxic herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, if we exercise more, if we don't suffer from stress and burnout, if we are less lonely because we include everyone. In the Netherlands we have this tendency to talk about people with a distance to the labor market, but in fact we have created a labor market with distance to the people. So how can we make an inclusive labor market? And if we do all that, those costs for healthcare and the social domain, they will reduce drastically, and at the same time we have better health and a better quality of life. I must admit that, in all honesty, this also means that we become older, and the older we get, the more ill we get. And this is a challenge that I haven't figured out completely yet. Or die fast, yeah. Well, we have the means to die fast these days.
If you're healthy, then you die fast. So that's the whole thing.
Okay, it goes automatically. Yeah. Well, but yeah, and the other artificial means is something that you cannot impose on people, of course. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I do have the mic right now.
I can't see from here who. I see just she's
here.
in the middle section.
Light can be illuminating and it can be blinding, and in this case it's more of the latter. But
okay, I'll try and just use the mic to be vocal. I do have a question. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was quite insightful. I do have the question, what does "we shouldn't forget poor people" actually mean?
Sure.
aka, how can we actively include them and create an us? And maybe that also links to the question, science is real and a science-based approach is valuable and most likely the right one. How can we though overcome flaws and privileges and biases in our current academic system regarding peer-reviewed papers and all of that? Because this is not necessarily representative of all humans, kind of, in that kind of sense.
well, let me focus on the first question first. I think what we need to understand, often when I give guest lectures to students, I ask them, so tell me, you study in the economic domain, what is the economy? And they answer me, GDP or money. I said, well, GDP exists for 90 years this year. And we talk already about the economy since the Gilgamesh Epos, which was written over 4,000 years ago. So what is the economy without money? And they don't know. and they don't know what the economy is without GDP. And then I started explaining them. I did lots of research in various African countries. And there, in many rural places, the dominant economic form is subsistence economy. So there is small, relatively small societies that have been living on a piece of land for ages. And the land provides in their food, their medicines, and the resources for houses, tools, and textiles. And I don't want to romanticize this, but they have a very fascinating informal institutional fabric in which they make agreements with each other. How are we going to divide the labor, and how are we going to divide the revenues from the land? And this is based on reciprocity and equal. And of course, I've seen also in Africa many tribes, and they have a chief, and for somehow reason he is entitled or privileged to have more. I don't know how that works, but apparently this is something universal. But in a way, there's different ways, and they meet their needs. So often people also confuse welfare from well-being. And welfare and well-being, welfare is determined in terms of well-being in the classical economic history. So welfare means the extent to which societies and individuals can meet their needs. It's not about your material prosperity or your financial prosperity. It is the extent to which you can meet your needs. And it may even happen that if you have lots of money, you are less successful in meeting your needs than when you have little money or average money. So that's what we need to put the horse in front of the cart again and say, okay, it's about meeting the needs. And this is, I think, also important in terms of development aid, that we see, okay, how can we build economies, whether subsistence, whether market-based economies, whether hybrid, in order to meet the needs. And I think at the same time, we can learn so much from those tribes that we call primitive in the Netherlands. When it comes down to local communities, when it comes down to sharing, when it comes down to being satisfied with enough. So I think this relationship should be much more equal, and I hope that this is some sort of transition that what we now call development aid will go into. Then about the science, there is lots of scientific literature talking about sufficiency, talking about meeting needs, talking about hedonistic needs versus eudaimonia, and it's all there. At the same time, they're hardcore economists, and they are the most difficult to convince because they are, I don't know what has happened. Are they indoctrinated by a certain ideology or discipline? It's speculative, but they are less susceptible to anything that conflicts with numerical or material growth. And in fact, economy did not happen to be a science until a couple of decades ago. I learned that from Egbert. And it were the Chicago boys who said, well, if we want to be taken seriously, then economy has to become a science, like it were an exact science physics, or so they started to quantify all kinds of things. They started to make models based on all kinds of debatable assumptions, and it looks very nice, figures, models, trends, graphs, and then they were accepted as a science. But the problem is the assumptions on which those models and all those quantitative analyses are based, they are so debatable, and that is something that is not easily to get out of the minds who have devoted their lives to these models, to this ideology, to this way of thinking. In the best scenario, it takes time and patience. I don't always have patience, but I'm trying to train myself.
Thank you, Matthias. Unfortunately, time's up.